pleasure to introduce Juan Luis Mejia. Juan Luis Mejia is currently the president of EAFIT University, former Minister of Culture. And we have a small change in the schedule because of agendas, but so it's a pleasure to introduce Juan Luis.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I feel quite strange here amongst so many architects showing so many beautiful things. I will be showing you today different things. I will be showing you in these next 15 minutes, thanks to the irresponsibility that allows us to try to treat and touch on 300 years in 15 minutes. So when we talk about the idea of the appropriation of these landscape that we consider to be a natural value, actually has been a very long process of going and coming. The first thing is the negation of what that landscape is throughout the Spanish colonization. We actually said we worked against the landscape, taking into account that the American landscape did not exist. It was more of a European one. And this was one of our most important painters of the colony, Gregorio Vasquez. If you can see the few landscapes that he actually illustrated, or where we actually framed some of our biblical and saint situations, as you can see, they're biblical, but almost all of them have been copied from the flamenco paintings that were coming in through these lands. There's a very symbolic thing here, or something that really tells us a lot, is that the only works of Gregorio Vasquez that are not religious are some allegorations of the four seasons. From there, so the first proximity to a landscape or to the idea of the nature in the Americas is when we actually started owning up on our own space. It's the botanic expedition. This was one of many botanic expeditions that were in Latin America at the end of the Gorgonic period era, especially through the kingship of Carlos III. There was some very important expeditions in Mexico. There was one in Ruiz Ravon in Peru, and this one was the botanic expedition in the new of Granada, which is what Colombia is today. It definitely wasn't easy. Mutis, is everybody familiar with Celestino Mutis? He was actually working more or less 20 years working with the royalty to be able to do this exhibition about the flowers and all of that ideas. Just after 20 years, you had the opportunity to come as a doctor in one of the rice royals. We're talking about 1663. He started working in front of the court to receive an authorization to be able to organize a botanic expedition to these lands. It was impossible. He had to wait 20 years to be able to do that. It was the first awareness of what nature was in this country. It was something marvelous, taking into account that these relationships, these networks being formed, these scientific networks that started being created at the end of the 18th century. He had understandings and he had correspondence with Linneo. He was one of the first scientists in that universal scientist where everybody tried to classify things. Linneo had a series of networks distributed around the world, and between them in Latin America with Mutis. And Mutis actually sent different test samples of plants, and here we can see that Linneo actually baptized the eval towards him. It's a very beautiful picture because for the painter to give this homage to Mutis, he actually created this idea, yes? It was the first situation where the Americans actually confronted their nature. And unfortunately, this expedition, where we restored a major part of the independence, the first thing that they had in this conquisition.
And so all of the material today is in the botanical garden in America. Who really would discover the American landscape and would somehow transform the idea of geography in the world is Humboldt. He arrives in Venezuela in 1779, and then he goes to New Granada to meet Mutis. Specifically, he arrives at Cartagena. Around Cartagena, he observes an eclipse, and then he goes down the Magdalena River, and he arrives at Santa Fe de Bogota. He meets Mutis, and he continues in his trajectory toward Quito, and from Quito, he goes to Peru, and then he goes through the current of Humboldt, and he ends up in Mexico. But along the Andes, he gives this to the world. He contributes this, which is the geography of the plants. And it's all about how in the tropics, the subject of the formation of the landscape isn't owed to the stations of the year or to the seasons, but to the thermal floors. His cuts here are marvelous, where we can see each of the plants that are in each of the strata of the levels of the sea, all the way up to the tops of the mountains. And so this contribution of Humboldt would later be followed by the first painters. Once we had independence, we essentially opened the frontiers or the borders, and European painters begin to arrive from the Humboldt school. This is Albert Berg. He is one of the disciples of Humboldt who begins to express the idea of Humboldt's idea of the geography of plants. And so we can identify, in contrast to the painters of the colonies, we couldn't identify if they were imaginary plants or indigenous or European. Now we could describe not just the flora but the fauna and the geography, the American geography. This is Rugendas. He would be the great disciple of Humboldt, who would travel from Brazil, then Mexico and Chile and Argentina. He would essentially discover the Mapuches, and he would represent in images the theory of Humboldt with respect to the geography of plants. These are some of the landscapes. Rugendas continues the path of Humboldt through Mexico. This is when he goes from Jalapa to the Valley of Mexico with the volcano of Orizaba at the end. Then we would have a first approximation, I would say, our approximation, in 1848, with what was called the Choreográfica Commission. This is like the second great attempt after the botanical expedition to basically empower ourselves over the territory. It was promoted by Mosquera, taking advantage of having one of those Italians that were around here after the Napoleonic Wars, who was Agustin Codazzi. Codazzi had set up the geography of Venezuela, and we were envious that Venezuela had a great geography and we didn't. This was to say that Venezuela knew on what territory they had their sovereignty, and so Mosquera, taking advantage that Codazzi and these people had essentially been disgraced in Venezuela after the fall of the nation, they were brought to Colombia, and so the Choreográfica Commission begins. Choreographic means description of a country, and so it incorporates not just the theoretical description, but the graphical or the visual description. This, for example, is an Englishman who comes here to Antioquia, is Enrique Price, and he brings with him the pictorial ability of the English travelers. He was really an accountant and creator of a philharmonic orchestra, but due to the need of a painter, he was brought along, and he was the first who was going to essentially describe pictorically this landscape and construct a great geography of the country, illustrated through these painters. Unfortunately, as with many things in this country, he was essentially truncated due to political issues, and good part of this work it becomes dispersed and it never reaches conclusion. And I like to bring it along with a current photography of the stone, the Piedra del Peñol, because it is an aggression toward our landscape. It's something else that we're going to see later on. This is Henry Price. This is our aquarelle painter. This is the Rio Negro Bay. This is Santa Fe de Antioquia. This is the Guadalupe Fall. So it's essentially the first appropriation of our landscape, but in reality, the process of recognizing ourselves. I like that verb, this recognition, to recognize, because it's one of those words that it says the same thing one way and the other. So the process of recognizing ourselves only begins in the 19th century, and there's a date that is really important, which is 1892, in which this painter, Francisco Antonio Cano, spontaneously and autonomously begins to carry out the first autonomous landscapes in which the characters are part of the scenery. They're not the central motif of the painting. To that point, it was the portrait was essentially the main motif, but now the landscapes began to take their own autonomy within the painting. And then we have the emblem painting, which is the horizons, which is the conquering of the territory. Now the territory is conquered. Now the acts of our elders have acted upon these territories, and still we had this value. And it's interesting to look at how values today are becoming anti-values. And this was essentially an emblem of ours, which was the process of empowerment over the territory. That process coincides not only with a visual movement, but there's an intellectual movement around that appropriation of what is ours, and it is a process of identity. It's very interesting, not just from painting, but from geography. This man, this doctor, has just published in Paris. He spent all of his savings publishing the first geography, the first description of our territory. It is beautiful to read this geography. It's very poetic. There is, for example, the description of a lagoon in a town close here, Heliconia. And that lagoon is characterized because there are two ducks that live in it. And there's something very innocent, but there's also a lot of appropriation over this landscape, which coincides with our first botanicals. Dr. Andrés Posada Arango begins to publish scientific studies. It's very interesting. It's a school of botanical scientists. Dr. Andrés Posada Arango, Mr. Uribe, Joaquin Antonio Uribe. And so, not just from painting, but from the from science, we begin to take power or take control of our territory. And so, while Cano is painting those first landscapes, Tomás Carrasquilla is in Santo Domingo writing the first novel, the first Colombian novel. This is very interesting because this isn't spontaneous. It arises. There was a literary circle called the Casino Literario, and when one of their discussions they were wondering why there wasn't novel in Colombia, and so many sustained that there wasn't any novel-worthy material, Carrasquilla. And then later, Carlos R. Restrepo, ex-president, said that there wasn't novel, not due to a lack of subject, but a lack of novelists. And so the novel is a human drama, and so there's a proposal. They tell Carrasquilla, if you say that there is novel material, then write one. And he writes one, and it is the first model it was the first novel that we could say is Colombian, and it is the first in which the landscape really appears within literature. The proper names of the plants, the pomo, the arrayan, the chumbimbo, they begin to appear in that literature, as well as in Cano's painting. And so spontaneously this other marvelous character, Romulo Carvajal from Sonson, in these small tablets of 15 by 10 centimeters, begins to, without learning about the theory of Impressionism, he begins to recreate or express this the landscapes that he sees from his house in Sonson, and we begin to see this process, and others in a more innocent manner. But we see this is the Aburrá Valley. This is a very unknown painter by the name of Gregorio Ramirez. These were the old landscapes. This part of the valley was dedicated to agriculture because this is where there was the most rain. The drier section was dedicated to keeping cattle and animals, essentially livestock. And so through other techniques we begin to empower ourselves over this territory, and it becomes a part of our history and our painting throughout the 20th century. Till then, at the end of the 20th century, painters begin to perceive the landscape differently. This is an intervention by Carlos Uribe, in which, in a parody of the horizons, he's not pointing at the promised land, he's pointing at the plain that is fumigating the cocaine fields. And so that vision of painting with the aggressiveness of the landscape begins to change. Mr. Rodrigo Callejas, Luis's father, in a dramatic series, shows what we had sung, what we had created, we had now destroyed, and we see this process of the negation of our landscape to the destruction of the landscape, or the transformation of it. And so urban painters, the current painters, don't look at the mountains pointing at the promised land. Now they, as like Freddy Serna, they're looking at the mountains that we have invaded with the new urbanization. Thank you.